Picture this. You stand in a crowded field, the air thick with the scent of trampled grass and roasted meats. The sun beats down on a sea of colorful banners, their silk snapping in the breeze. At the center of it all, a herald in vibrant livery raises a gleaming horn to his lips. The blast echoes across the grounds, silencing the crowd. In a voice that carries to the farthest edges, he proclaims the beginning of the grand tournament, a spectacle of chivalry, courage, and glory. Knights in shining armor prepare to clash, nobles lean forward in anticipation, and the common folk cheer for their champions. It's a moment of pure, breathtaking theater. But what you're witnessing is only the final act of a story months, sometimes years in the making. Behind that single, glorious moment lies an entire hidden world of meticulous planning, staggering logistics, and human endeavor on an almost unimaginable scale. We often see these tournaments through the lens of legend, the heroic jousts, the lavish feasts, the courtly romance. What we don't see are the armies of craftsmen, the shrewd stewards managing bottomless coffers, the diplomats negotiating safe passage for rivals, and the engineers who literally moved mountains to build these temporary cities of spectacle. This was the medieval equivalent of organizing the Olympics, a royal wedding, and a military campaign all at once, often with nothing but parchment, messengers on horseback, and sheer force of will. That hidden world, the true engine behind the pageantry, is what we're about to explore together. This is a journey into the heart of medieval tournament preparations, a deep dive into the forgotten blueprints of these legendary events. We'll uncover how they fed thousands, how they built arenas without modern tools, how they prevented these displays of martial skill from exploding into actual warfare, and how they crafted stories so powerful they still capture our imagination today. So come with me, let's pull back the curtain on the greatest shows of the Middle Ages and discover the astonishing secrets that made them possible. So why go to all this trouble? Why would a lord or king pour a fortune into an event that might only last a few days? The answer lies in ambition. A tournament was never just a simple sporting event. It was a carefully crafted statement, a powerful tool wielded by the elite to shape their world. At its core, hosting a tournament was the ultimate flex of medieval power. Think of it as a live-action version of a kingdom's resume, designed to impress friends and intimidate rivals simultaneously. A king might stage a grand tournament to celebrate a major victory, demonstrating that his reign was not only successful, but also stable and prosperous enough to fund such lavish entertainment. It sent a clear message to any restless barons or neighboring rulers thinking of causing trouble. The sheer scale of the event, the quality of the prizes, and the number of knights attending all served as tangible proof of the host's wealth and the loyalty he commanded. For a younger nobleman, perhaps newly come into his inheritance, hosting a successful tournament could establish his reputation, showing his peers that he was a man of means, generosity, and chivalric virtue, worthy of their respect and alliance. Beyond raw power projection, these events were masterclasses in political theater and diplomacy. A royal wedding, the signing of a crucial treaty, or the visit of an important foreign dignitary provided the perfect excuse for a tournament. The festivities became the backdrop for delicate negotiations and alliance building. Knights who might have been enemies on a battlefield last season could compete as rivals in the lists, their aggression channeled into a controlled, ceremonial outlet, all under the watchful and generous eye of their host. This wasn't just about keeping them busy, it was about binding them to the court through shared experience, lavish gifts, and the powerful currency of honor. By presiding over the games and bestowing the awards, the host positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of chivalry, the sun around which all other stars revolved. And we cannot forget the social function. For the common people, life was often grueling and monotonous. A tournament broke that routine, offering a spectacular holiday. The Lord provided days of free entertainment, feasting, and markets, fostering a sense of communal celebration and goodwill. This was a brilliant strategy for maintaining social cohesion. By giving his subjects an outlet for excitement and pride, he reinforced their loyalty and made his rule appear not just powerful, but also beneficent. In a society built on stark hierarchies, the tournament was a rare occasion where everyone, from the highest duke to the lowest farmer, participated in the same story, a story where the host was the undisputed author and hero. But before a single banner could be hung or a single invitation sent, there was a hurdle so immense it could stop the entire endeavor before it even began. This wasn't a matter of logistics or cost, it was a matter of law and survival. You see, in the eyes of a medieval monarch, any unauthorized gathering of armed, trained knights was not a potential sporting event, it was a potential rebellion. The very thing that made tournaments so magnificent, the concentration of military power from across the land, was also what made them incredibly dangerous from a royal perspective. This is where the delicate and absolutely critical dance of securing royal patronage began. A hopeful lord didn't just decide to throw a tournament, he had to essentially petition the crown for the privilege. This process was far more than a formality. It was a high-stakes test of loyalty and diplomacy. The aspiring host would dispatch his most trusted envoys, often including family members or high-ranking church officials, to the royal court. Their mission was to formally request a charter, a written grant of permission that legally sanctioned the event. The negotiations behind this charter were a complex game. The envoys had to assuage every possible fear the king might have. They would offer binding assurances that the tournament would serve the crown's interests, not undermine them. Promises were made that the event would strengthen alliances favorable to the king, that it would be a display of the realm's unity and strength under his rule, and that all participants would swear oaths of peace for the duration. This was often accompanied by a not-so-subtle financial gift, a substantial donation to the royal treasury that framed the charter not as a right, but as a generous favor bestowed by a gracious sovereign. For the king, granting this permission was a powerful political tool. It allowed him to control where and when these massive gatherings happened, ensuring they were held by allies in secure locations, not by potential rivals in problematic border regions. By giving his blessing, he transformed a possible threat into a tool of his own statecraft. The tournament, once sanctioned, became an extension of his court, a place where he could visibly act as the pinnacle of the chivalric world, rewarding loyalty and commanding the service of his most powerful vassals. The coveted charter was the first and most vital piece of parchment, the foundation upon which the entire temporary city of spectacle would be built. Without it, the entire dream collapsed under the weight of royal suspicion. With the king's precious charter secured, the monumental task of turning a royal promise into a physical reality could finally begin. And it all started with the ground beneath their feet. You might think any large, open field would do for a tournament, but the reality was far more complex. The selection of the site was a strategic decision of the highest order, a puzzle with multiple pieces that all had to fit together perfectly. This was not a choice made on a whim. It was the result of weeks, sometimes months, of careful surveying, negotiation, and logistical calculation. The most obvious need was space, a massive, flat, and clear area known as the lists. This central arena had to be enormous, not just for the jousting lane itself, but for the tilt yards for foot combat, the pavilions of the competing knights, and the grand wooden stands known as the scaffolds for the noble attendees. But the site's requirements extended far beyond the main event space. Think of it as building a temporary capital city that would house and entertain thousands of people for weeks. The entire encampment, a vibrant and bustling tent city for knights, their squires, servants, and entertainers, needed room to sprawl. Proximity to a major town or castle was non-negotiable. This wasn't for the view, it was a matter of survival. A nearby settlement acted as a crucial supply depot and a reservoir of labor. Its markets would be empty to feed the hordes, its craftsmen hired for last-minute repairs, and its population would swell the audience, adding to the event's prestige and energy. However, this proximity was a double-edged sword. The site had to be close enough for easy access, but far enough away to prevent the massive gathering from overwhelming the town's defenses, draining its wells dry, or causing rampant disease. It was a delicate balancing act between convenience and security. Then came the question of access. How would all these people and their supplies actually get there? This made the road network perhaps the single most important factor after the charter itself. Major routes had to be passable for heavy carts laden with timber for the stands, barrels of wine and ale, and the immense weight of knights in full-plate armor traveling with their entourages. A site with poor road connections was simply impossible, no matter how perfect the field itself might be. Furthermore, a reliable source of fresh water was absolutely critical. A river or several strong springs were needed not only for drinking for thousands of people and their horses, but for the countless other needs of a medieval camp: cooking, washing, and cooling down overworked animals. A site without ample water would become a humanitarian disaster within days, but the medieval organizers were also masters of spectacle, and they understood the power of a good view. The ideal location often featured a natural slope or bowl-shaped terrain surrounding the lists. This natural amphitheater meant that even those who couldn't afford a seat in the expensive wooden scaffolds could still find a spot on a grassy hillside to see the action unfold below. This thoughtful inclusion of the common folk maximized the audience, enhanced the atmosphere, and reinforced the social order everyone could watch, but from distinctly different vantage points that reflected their status. Finally, this perfect piece of land had to be acquired. This involved the host's stewards engaging in lengthy negotiations with local landowners, often monasteries or local gentry. Agreements were drawn up for the temporary use of the land, involving compensation for any crops that would be trampled and guarantees that the property would be restored to its original state after the event. Every detail, from the right to dig latrine trenches to the collection of firewood, had to be formally agreed upon. The selection of the ground was the first concrete step in the process, transforming the abstract idea of a tournament into a specific place on the map, setting the stage for the incredible transformation that was to come. Now, with the king's blessing secured and the perfect site selected, the theoretical plan needed a single individual to transform it into reality. This monumental responsibility fell to one man, the tournament marshal. If the king was the visionary and the host was the financier, the marshal was the chief executive officer, the general contractor, and the head referee all rolled into one. His role was arguably the most difficult of all, a relentless test of administrative skill, diplomatic finesse, and sheer force of personality. He was the spider at the center of a vast and intricate web, and every single thread of the operation led back to him. His first and most terrifying task was budgeting. The host provided the funds, but the marshal was the steward, entrusted with a fortune that could literally make or break his lord's financial future. He had to account for every single penny. His ledgers would itemize staggering costs: thousands of feet of timber for the stands and barriers, hundreds of yards of silk and linen for banners and pavilions, the purchase of enough food and drink to sustain a small army for weeks, and the fees for a small army of skilled laborers. A single miscalculation, an overlooked expense, or a contractor who delivered shoddy work could result in a financial disaster that would embarrass his lord and tarnish his own reputation forever. This was high-stakes accounting with no room for error. From the budget flowed an impossibly complex schedule. The marshal was the master of time, coordinating a symphony of tasks that all had to conclude in perfect harmony on opening day. Woodcutters and carpenters had to fell trees and construct the stands and viewing galleries with weeks to spare. Tilers and thatchers were hired to build temporary kitchens and stables. Blacksmiths needed enough lead time to shoe hundreds of horses and repair countless pieces of armor. Butchers, bakers, and brewers had to begin their workdays in advance to ensure there was fresh bread and ale, not just on day one, but for the entire duration of the event. The marshal's calendar was a thing of meticulous beauty, a cascade of dependent events where a single delay could create chaos. Then came the hiring. The marshal didn't just manage tasks, he managed an entire temporary economy. He was responsible for recruiting and overseeing a small city's worth of staff. This included the obvious roles like stable hands, armorers, and servers, but also a host of specialized professionals we might not immediately consider. He needed heralds to announce the knights and adjudicate the rules of combat. He hired teams of surgeons and barbers to tend to the inevitable wounds. He contracted musicians, jesters, and actors to provide continuous entertainment in the camps. He even needed a small security force of men-at-arms to keep the peace, prevent petty theft in the tent city, and manage the crowds. Each of these hires required vetting, negotiation, and integration into the overall plan, all managed by the marshal and his small team of clerks. Perhaps his most delicate responsibility was his role as the ultimate arbiter of the rules. Long before the first lance was couched, the marshal, often with a council of senior heralds, would publish and disseminate the tournament's specific code of conduct. This was far more than a simple set of rules. It was a detailed legal framework designed to prevent the festivities from degenerating into a bloody brawl. It specified the types of weapons allowed, the target areas on an opponent's body for scoring points, the value of different actions like shattering a lance or unseating a rider, and the procedures for a knight to yield or claim victory. Most importantly, it outlined the punishments for breaking these rules, which could include heavy fines, forfeiture of armor and horse, or even public dishonor. The marshal had to ensure every single participant, from the greatest duke to the poorest knight-errant, understood and agreed to these terms, making him the final judge in any dispute both on and off the field. His word was law, and his ability to enforce it fairly was what separated a legendary tournament from a forgotten catastrophe. With the sites secured and the marshal's meticulous plans in hand, the field, once peaceful and empty, would erupt into a cacophony of industry. The true scale of the endeavor became visible as an army of craftsmen descended upon the location, transforming it from a simple meadow into a dedicated sporting arena and a temporary city. This was a construction project of immense ambition, achieved with nothing but hand tools, brute strength, and generations of perfected skill. At the heart of this organized chaos were the carpenters, the unsung heroes whose work literally framed the entire tournament experience for every single attendee, from the highest king to the lowliest groundling. Their most prestigious and complex task was the erection of the grandstands, known as scaffolds. These were not simple bleachers. They were elaborate temporary structures designed to showcase the social hierarchy in physical form. Built from thousands of feet of freshly cut timber, these tiered viewing galleries were engineered for both spectacle and safety. The best seats, enclosed by protective barriers and often shaded by colorful awnings, were reserved for the nobility, hosting royalty, the hosting lord and his family, and their most honored guests. The carpenters had to ensure these structures were not only impressive to look at, but also structurally sound. The weight of hundreds of people, all leaning forward in excitement during a climactic joust, placed enormous stress on the joints and beams. A collapse would be more than an embarrassment. It would be a catastrophic tragedy that could end a dynasty. Every nail hammered, every rope lashed, had to hold. But the carpenters' work extended far beyond the VIP section. They also built the viewing galleries for the common folk, simpler raised platforms that allowed a much larger audience to see over the heads of the crowd gathered at ground level. While less ornate, these structures were just as vital to the event's atmosphere and profitability, as selling access to these stands was a key source of revenue. They also constructed the crucial barriers that define the tournament field itself, the wooden tilt barrier that separated charging knights in the joust, preventing head-on collisions and guiding lances toward their targets, and the stout fences that enclosed the lists for melee combat, keeping the fighting contained and the audience safe. Scattered around the periphery of the main arena, other specialized structures rose from the ground. The carpenters built the quintains, a rotating post with a shield on one arm and a weight on the other, used by squires and young knights to practice their lance work. A poorly aimed strike would spin the arm around to deliver a humiliating, and sometimes painful, blow to the aspirant's back, a constant reminder that skill, not just brute force, was required. Dozens of smaller pavilions and tents were also erected, serving as everything from temporary chapels and arbitration courts to medical stations and butchers' stalls. None of this would have been possible without the supporting crafts. The rope makers were absolutely essential, producing miles of sturdy cordage from hemp or flax. This rope was used for 1,000 different tasks, lashing wooden frames together, raising heavy banners and awnings, securing guy lines for the countless tents, and even marking boundaries. The sound of hammers striking iron was a constant backdrop as blacksmiths and their apprentices worked furiously at portable forges, producing the countless nails, clamps, and hinges required to hold the wooden city together. And overseeing the creation of the most colorful elements were the pavilioners, the specialists in charge of the large, elaborate tents for the competing knights and nobles. These were not simple shelters, they were mobile statements of wealth and identity, made from vast expanses of linen, canvas, and expensive fabrics like silk and fustian, often painted or embroidered with brilliant heraldic designs. The pavilioners ensured that a knight's residence in the tent city was a public display of his status, making the entire encampment a vibrant heraldic tapestry. This collective effort of sawing, hammering, and weaving was the physical manifestation of the tournament's promise, turning a blank field into a stage set for chivalric drama. Yet for all the hammering and sawing, for all the meticulous planning and budgeting, a tournament site remained just a collection of empty structures without its most vital ingredient, people. And attracting the right participants, the famous knights, the powerful nobles, the very stars of the show, was a challenge all its own. This is where a truly unique and indispensable figure entered the picture, a man whose voice was the instrument that transformed a local event into a legend heard across kingdoms. We are talking about the herald, the master of ceremonies and the living archive of the chivalric world. Long before the first tent peg was driven into the chosen field, the herald's work began. Armed with the official proclamation from the tournament's patron, he would embark on a weeks-long journey across the realm and often into neighboring lands. His mission was part town crier, part royal diplomat, and part celebrity publicist. He didn't just post notices on castle gates, he gained entrance to great halls and courtly gatherings, where he would deliver the invitation in a powerful, trained voice designed to capture the imagination of every knight present. He would announce the date, the location, and most importantly, the prizes. The promise of valuable spoils, a purse of gold, a fine warhorse, or a jeweled sword, was a powerful lure, but so was the promise of immortal glory. The herald sold the dream of renown, assuring every potential competitor that their deeds in the coming contest would be sung by minstrels and recorded in chronicles for generations to come. He was the spark that ignited the competitive fervor of an entire class of warriors. As knights began to arrive at the tournament field, the herald's role shifted from broadcaster to chief of security and master of records. In an age before photography or standardized identification, how did you prevent a low-born mercenary from borrowing a suit of armor and falsely competing under a noble banner to claim the rich prizes? The answer was the herald and his encyclopedic knowledge of heraldry. Each knight was required to present himself and his unique coat of arms to the herald's scrutiny. These men were walking databases, able to recognize thousands of distinct shields, colors, and crests, and more importantly, the lineages and families they represented. They maintained detailed rolls of arms, illustrated manuscripts that cataloged the nobility. If a knight's insignia was unknown, or if it conflicted with a known record, the herald had the authority to bar him from competing, protecting the event's exclusivity and the sacred social order it was designed to celebrate. Once the contests began, the herald transformed once more, this time into the ultimate referee and play-by-play commentator. Stationed at the edge of the lists, he observed every pass of the joust and every clash of the melee with a trained eye. It was his job to score the action based on the complex rules established by the marshal. Did a knight strike his opponent's helm cleanly? Did he break his lance on the shield? Was the strike delivered with sufficient force and accuracy to be counted? The herald's call was final, but his duties extended far beyond simple adjudication. Between rounds, he would move before the crowds, amplifying the drama. In a booming voice, he would recount the best blows of the day, praise the valor of the competitors, and narrate the unfolding story of the tournament, building up the reputations of the winners and ensuring that every heroic deed was witnessed and remembered by all. He turned violent combat into a story of chivalry, his narration providing the context that elevated a physical contest into a moral drama about honor, courage, and skill. Without the herald, a tournament was just a fight. With him, it became a legend in the making. Now, amidst the pounding of hammers and the fluttering of newly raised banners, another far more urgent sound would have begun to dominate the tournament field, the relentless rumble of supply carts. For all the grandeur of the lists and the glamour of the heraldic display, the entire enterprise rested on a foundation far more basic and perilous: the ability to feed everyone. This was perhaps the single greatest logistical challenge, a mammoth undertaking that would test the organizational limits of the medieval world. We must remember that a major tournament was not a one-day affair. It could last a week or more, and the encampment it created was, for its duration, one of the largest population centers in the entire region. The host was not just entertaining a few hundred nobles, he was providing for a small, hungry, and thirsty mobile city. The sheer scale of consumption is almost incomprehensible to us today. Let's put some staggering numbers to it. A conservative estimate for a large event might involve feeding 5,000 people for a week. The primary source of protein was meat, and it was consumed in quantities that would beggar belief. Accounts from similar large medieval feasts record the provisioning of hundreds of oxen, thousands of sheep and pigs, and countless numbers of poultry and game birds like swans, peacocks, and herons. This wasn't meat carefully butchered and shipped in from afar. This required the driving of entire herds of live animals to the site. Temporary pens would be constructed at the periphery of the camp, and in the days leading up to the event, the air would be filled with the constant lowing and bleating of doomed livestock, followed by the grim, round-the-clock work of the butchers. The scale of the slaughter was such that it often had to be done on site to prevent the meat from spoiling, a grim and bloody counterpoint to the chivalric spectacle being prepared. And all that meat required something to wash it down. In an era where water safety was unreliable, the primary drink for everyone, from lords to laborers, was ale. The quantities brewed were astronomical. A single barrel of ale might hold over 30 gallons. It's estimated that a gathering of several thousand people could easily consume 1,000 barrels or more over the course of a week. This meant local breweries would have been working for months in advance, requisitioning entire harvests of barley and hops from the surrounding countryside. The host stewards had to coordinate the brewing, the transportation of these immensely heavy barrels, and their storage in temporary cellars dug into the ground to keep them cool. Wine, a more expensive import, was reserved for the high tables, but even that was needed in huge volumes, requiring negotiations with merchants who would travel great distances to cater to such a wealthy clientele. Then there was bread, the true staff of life. To feed thousands, you need an army of bakers and an avalanche of grain. Dozens of temporary clay ovens would be constructed around the site, their fires burning day and night. The flour for this operation required the efforts of multiple watermills grinding grain incessantly for weeks. The most common bread was a coarse, dark loaf for the masses, while finer, whiter manchet bread was baked for the nobility. The demand for other staples was equally immense. Mountains of cheese and butter would be brought in from local dairy farms. Rivers of oatmeal and pottage, a thick, hearty stew would be prepared in vast cauldrons. This wasn't fine dining for most, it was fuel on a colossal scale. But here's where the medieval mind demonstrated its economic sophistication. The host and his marshal were not expected to provide all of this for free. While the noble attendees and the competing knights were guests who were feasted at the host's expense, the thousands of commoners, merchants, servants, and hangers-on created a booming temporary market economy. The tournament site became a commercial magnet. The host's officials would license vendors, granting them the right to set up stalls and sell their goods for a fee. This created a vibrant fairground atmosphere surrounding the main event. Food sellers offered pies, sausages, sweetmeats, and roasted nuts. Craftsmen sold trinkets, ribbons, and souvenirs. It was a tremendous economic opportunity for the entire region. This system was brilliantly efficient. It allowed the host to focus his vast resources on catering to his high-status guests, while the needs of the general populace were met by a self-regulating market that flocked to the site, drawn by the promise of profit. The host stewards still had to manage this chaos, ensuring there was enough space for the market, settling disputes between vendors, and collecting licensing fees that helped offset the event's mind-boggling cost. The success of a tournament was ultimately measured not just by the splendor of the jousts, but by the simple fact that when the horn blew for the feast, there was actually enough food on the table for everyone. A single miscalculation here, a shortage of bread or a souring of the ale, could turn a celebration into a riot, undoing all the carefully constructed prestige in an instant. The ability to avert this disaster was the ultimate testament to a lord's power and his administration's skill. Imagine the horizon stirring not with an army, but with a slow, glittering parade of honor. Days before the tournament's official start, the roads leading to the chosen field would become rivers of color and sound, as the competing knights began their grand arrival. This was not a discreet check-in, it was a calculated display, a key part of the psychological warfare that began long before the first clash of steel. Each knight traveled as a minor lord in his own right, leading a personal entourage that was a small, mobile village. His war horses, the magnificent destriers, were led by squires, their powerful frames groomed to a shine. Carts laden with weapon chests, armor stands, and personal provisions creaked along, followed by pages, grooms, armorers, and often a personal herald or chaplain. The arrival of a single knight was an event. The arrival of dozens was a spectacle that announced the tournament's promise was being fulfilled. This migrating nobility required immediate lodging, and within hours, the empty field beside the lists began to transform into one of the most vibrant sights of the Middle Ages, the tent city. This was not a haphazard campground. It was a meticulously organized, albeit temporary, reflection of the social order. Knights of higher rank and greater wealth claimed the prime spots closest to the arena, erecting vast, elaborate pavilions that were miniature castles made of fabric. These structures were complex affairs with multiple rooms, sewn from expensive cloth like silk or fustian, and proudly displaying the knight's coat of arms on all sides, a brilliant declaration of his identity for all to see. As more competitors arrived, the city grew into a bustling, colorful heraldic tapestry, a vivid map of lineage and alliance where you could literally walk from the banners of Normandy to those of Burgundy. The air filled with the sounds of blacksmiths making last-minute adjustments to armor, squires practicing their drills, and the mingling of a dozen different dialects and languages. This spontaneous city was a hub of networking, gossip, and intimidation, where a knight's wealth and status were on full display for his rivals to assess. But before any knight could dream of glory, he had to pass through a gate far more formidable than any opponent, the formal registration process. This was the crucial moment where the world of martial spectacle collided with the rigid bureaucracy of medieval chivalry. A knight, perhaps weary from travel, but projecting an air of confident nobility, would present himself with his key attendants at the Marshals' headquarters. This was no simple form-filling exercise. It was a verification of his very right to be there. The stakes were immense, the prizes were valuable, and the honor was priceless, which created a powerful incentive for fraud. A common man-at-arms could theoretically borrow a suit of plate armor and try to pass himself off as a noble knight to claim the rewards and renown. This is where the heralds earned their keep as the living encyclopedias of aristocracy. The registering knight had to provide proof of his identity and, most importantly, his right to bear the coat of arms painted on his shield and embroidered on his surcoat. He would present his credentials, perhaps a sealed letter from his liege lord or a known patron, and then subject his heraldic device to the most intense scrutiny. The heralds consulted their elaborate illuminated rolls of arms, books filled with detailed paintings of shields and the names of the nobles who owned them. They examined the colors, the patterns, the charges, and the crests with a detective's eye. Was the gold the right shade? Was the lion passant or rampant? Any discrepancy, any hint of false pretension, would see the applicant humiliatingly turned away, his armor confiscated, and his name added to a list of dishonorable cheats circulated to other tournaments. Once his identity was confirmed, the registration became a binding contract. The knight and his marshal would formally agree to the tournament's specific code of conduct, a detailed set of rules covering everything from the permitted types of weapons and armor to the scoring of points and the procedures for yielding. Crucially, they would also negotiate and post a financial pledge, a sum of money or valuable goods that served as their entry fee and a guarantee of good behavior. This pledge would be forfeited if they broke the rules, providing a powerful financial incentive to keep the chivalric ideals from collapsing into a common brawl. Only after this solemn, business-like ceremony was complete was the knight's name officially entered into the competition rolls. He was now no longer just a visitor. He was a recognized competitor, free to settle into his vibrant pavilion, size up his rivals, and prepare his spirit for the ultimate test of skill and honor that lay ahead. Yet amidst the pageantry of the tent city and the solemnity of the registration process, another essential industry thrived, one defined by the relentless, percussive soundtrack of metal striking metal. Scattered throughout the encampment, often clustered together in a designated area downwind of the noble pavilions, were the temporary forges and workshops of the armorers and blacksmiths. These were not permanent stone structures but mobile setups of astonishing efficiency, their presence announced by the glow of coals and the shower of sparks flying from grinding wheels. For the competing knights, these masters of metal were as vital as their squires. They were the guardians of both their safety and their competitive edge, performing miracles of repair and maintenance under immense pressure. The work was constant and frenetic, a race against the tournament's opening trumpet. The journey to the site alone could be hard on a knight's gear. A suit of plate armor, while offering superb protection, was a complex machine of interlocking steel plates, leather straps, and delicate rivets. A long ride in a jostling cart or on the back of a horse could loosen fittings, strain hinges, and create irritating pressure points. Before a knight could even think of competing, his armorer would conduct a full inspection, tightening every buckle, testing every articulation, and ensuring the helmet's visor opened and closed smoothly. This was preventative medicine for the battlefield of sport, a necessary check to ensure the tool was perfect before the craftsman used it. But the real drama began once the practice sessions started. In the days leading up to the main event, the tilt yards were alive with knights and their squires running drills, testing horses, and engaging in friendly, but undoubtedly vigorous, sparring matches. These practice bouts were essential for shaking off rust and acclimating to the ground, but they were also brutal on equipment. A poorly aimed practice strike with a blunted sword could still put a deep dent in a breastplate or pauldron. A fall from a horse, even at a walk, could bend a vambrace or misalign a gauntlet. After every session, squires would descend on the armorer's row, their arms laden with damaged pieces, each item a ticket to the back of a very long line. The armorers operated with the cool efficiency of an emergency room triage team. Apprentices would man the bellows, keeping the portable furnaces at a precise, roaring heat. The master smith would assess each piece, his experienced eye and hand determining the best course of action. A dent was carefully heated and hammered out on a small anvil, the rhythmic clang echoing through the camp. A broken strap or faulty hinge was swiftly replaced. The grindstones were in perpetual motion, their high-pitched whine a constant backdrop as they were used to sharpen swords and blunted lance tips to the required standard, a careful balance between lethality and safety. The most common sight of all was the endless stock of wooden lances. These were not durable weapons but designed to fail consumables. Carts of them were pre-positioned, and squires were constantly collecting fresh ones and returning splintered fragments, which would be gathered and chopped into firewood, fueling the very forges that enabled the next round of destruction. This created a thriving, pressurized economy within the economy. An armorer's reputation was his currency, and a knight would pay a premium for the services of a known master, especially one who could work quickly without sacrificing quality. The very best might even be retained exclusively by a wealthy lord for the duration of the tournament, attending only to his retinue's needs while turning away other lucrative business. For these craftsmen, the tournament circuit was their lifeblood, a traveling trade show where a job well done on a famous duke's helmet could secure them commissions for years to come. Their work continued right up to the final moments, with last-minute adjustments being made as knights were literally preparing to mount their horses. The ring of the hammer was the authentic sound of the tournament's engine room, a noisy, gritty, and absolutely essential service that kept the glittering world of chivalry functioning, one perfectly hammered dent at a time. While the knights themselves were the stars of the show, the entire glittering spectacle would have collapsed into chaos without its most vital and most overlooked workforce, the squires. These young men, often in their teens, were the unsung engines of the tournament, operating in a state of perpetual high-stakes motion. For them, this was not a holiday or a mere chance for glory. It was a grueling, real-world examination, a brutal test of their endurance, loyalty, and skill under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Their experience was less like attending a festival and more like surviving a boot camp where failure meant not just personal shame, but the potential downfall of their knightly master. The sheer physical labor began the moment they arrived. A knight's pavilion was not just a tent, it was a mobile command center and armory, and the squire was its chief logistics officer. His first and most sacred duty was the care and maintenance of the knight's arsenal. A full suit of plate armor was a technological marvel, but it was also a fiendishly complex and high-maintenance machine. After every use, whether in practice or in the actual lists, it had to be meticulously cleaned to prevent the insidious creep of rust. The squire would spend hours with rags, fine sand, and vinegar, polishing every steel plate to a mirror finish, checking for any hidden dents or stress fractures that could prove fatal in the next encounter. He had to oil the leather straps, tighten countless rivets, and ensure every hinge on the gauntlets and helmet worked with flawless precision. This was not a simple chore, it was a matter of life and death. A single stuck latch on a visor or a weakened strap could mean the difference between a knight breathing freely or suffocating inside his own helmet during a fall. But his responsibilities extended far beyond inanimate metal. The knight's most valuable asset, often worth a small fortune itself, was his destrier, the powerful, highly trained warhorse. The care of this magnificent animal fell entirely to the squire. This meant grooming the horse until its coat shone, mucking out its temporary stall, and ensuring it was fed a specific, energy-rich diet of grain and hay to keep it in peak fighting condition. The bond between a squire and his knight's charger was profound. He had to understand its temperament, its strengths, and its fears intimately. A skittish or poorly handled horse could unseat its rider at a critical moment, costing the knight the match and, more importantly, his honor. The squire was also the horse's trainer, putting it through its paces, practicing the complex maneuvers required for the joust, and ensuring it was accustomed to the deafening noise of the crowd and the flash of banners. When the trumpet finally blasted, signaling a knight's call to the lists, the squire's role shifted from preparer to active participant in a high-speed, high-stakes ritual, the arming of the knight. This was a carefully choreographed sequence that had to be executed with speed and absolute precision. There was no time for fumbling. The squire would help his master don the heavy layers of padded garments first, followed by the intricate process of locking on each piece of plate armor in its correct order. The greaves for the shins, the cuisses for the thighs, the gauntlets, the vambraces, and finally the heavy breastplate and backplate. The squire had to know the exact tension for every buckle and tie, ensuring the armor was secure enough to offer protection, but not so tight as to restrict movement or blood flow. The final act was the lowering of the great helm onto the knight's shoulders and securing it, often with a quiet word of luck. The squire then handed up the shield and the lance, his last tasks before his master, now an anonymous steel titan, rode out to seek his fortune. The squire would then watch, his heart in his throat, knowing that his own meticulous work was now being tested in the most violent way possible. Amidst this relentless service, the squires also seized their own opportunities for advancement. The tournament field was their classroom and their proving ground. In the lulls between the main events, they would gather in open areas to practice their own skills, holding informal junior tournaments known as pages' games or squires' melees. These were far less glamorous affairs, fought with blunted weapons and often older, borrowed armor, but the spirit was just as fierce. Here, they could practice the techniques they observed their masters using, building the muscle memory and courage they would one day need. For a young squire, performing well in these sideline skirmishes was a chance to be noticed not just by his own knight, but by other powerful nobles in attendance. A display of exceptional bravery or skill could lead to a recommendation for knighthood or a prestigious offer of patronage. The squire's encampment was a world within a world, a hive of youthful ambition and frantic preparation, where every polished piece of armor and every well-executed lance thrust was a silent prayer for a future of their own. They toiled in the shadows of giants, all for the dream of one day stepping into the light. Of all the events that defined the tournament, none captured the imagination quite like the joust. This was the main event, the glittering centerpiece around which all other festivities orbited. It was a breathtakingly violent ballet, a test of pure, unadulterated skill where two armored titans, identities hidden behind grim visors, charged at each other with lances couched, their entire world narrowing to a single onrushing point. But the thunderous climax of the shattered lance was merely the final second of a sequence that began with months of meticulous, dedicated preparation. The success of a knight in the lists wasn't just a matter of bravery. It was the product of a perfect partnership between man, animal, and a suite of specialized equipment, each element honed to a razor's edge. The foundation of this entire endeavor was the horse. A knight did not simply ride any steed into a joust. He depended on the destrier, a breed of war horse so powerful and expensive it was the medieval equivalent of a supercar. These animals were colossal, standing up to 17 hands high, and bred for a unique combination of raw strength, explosive acceleration, and a temperament that could withstand the deafening noise and chaos of the battlefield. Selecting the right destrier was the first critical step. A knight or his master of horse would look for specific physical traits: a deep chest for lung capacity, powerful hindquarters for the initial burst of speed out of the gate, and a strong, arched neck to help absorb the tremendous shock of the impact. But the physical was only half the story. The horse's temperament was even more crucial. It needed to be brave, responding to its rider's commands with unwavering obedience, even when charging directly toward another 1,000-pound animal at full speed. A skittish horse that shied away at the last second could not only lose the match, but send its rider tumbling into the path of the oncoming opponent with catastrophic results. Training a destrier for the joust was an art form in itself, a long process of desensitization and conditioning. The horse had to become utterly accustomed to the bizarre sights and sounds of the tournament field. Squires and grooms would wave flags and brightly colored cloths around them, bang shields together, and blast trumpets during their training sessions. They were trained to run in a perfectly straight line down the tilt barrier, ignoring the crowd and focusing solely on the command to charge. This was not a natural instinct for a prey animal, and it took a patient, expert hand to instill this discipline. The final piece of their training was acclimating them to the weight and feel of the specialized jousting armor, known as barding. This wasn't just for the knight's protection. A well-armored horse was less likely to be injured by a stray splinter or a poorly aimed blow, and a protected horse was a confident horse. The barding, often made of boiled leather or even plate steel, was decorated with the knight's heraldry, turning the mount into a moving emblem of its rider's identity. The bond between a knight and his destrier was profound. This was a partnership where trust was literally a matter of life and death. Then there was the lance itself, the iconic weapon of the joust. This was not a simple, sharpened pole for killing. It was a highly engineered piece of sporting equipment designed for a very specific type of controlled, spectacular violence. Jousting lances were typically made from spruce or ash, woods chosen for their good balance of strength and tendency to splinter safely. They were long, often 11 or 12 feet, and heavy, requiring significant strength just to couch and aim. But the most ingenious feature was their construction. Many were hollowed out down the center or built with a deliberately weakened section just behind the tip. This coronal tip, a 3- or 4-pronged head, was designed not to pierce armor but to grip the opponent's shield, transferring the full energy of the impact. The weakened shaft was engineered to shatter on a solid hit, a feature known as frushing. This splintering was not a flaw, it was the entire point. In the scoring system of the joust, breaking your lance cleanly on your opponent's shield or helm was the highest scoring action, worth far more than simply striking them or, worse, unhorsing them. The spectacular shower of wooden shards was the visual proof of a perfectly delivered blow, a moment of high drama that sent the crowd into a frenzy. The sound of the crack echoing across the field was the authentic sound of success. Armorers and squires maintained a huge supply of these lances, as a knight could go through dozens in a single tournament. Each one was a single-use instrument of glory, its destruction the ultimate testament to the knight's skill and power. Amidst all this physical preparation, however, was a profound psychological dimension. For the knight, the moments before a pass were a private trial of nerve. Seated high in the saddle, the world narrowed to a slit in his visor. The raucous cheers of the crowd faded into a dull roar, replaced by the sound of his own breathing echoing inside his helmet and the pounding of his heart. He would perform a final mental checklist, his stance in the stirrups, the grip on his lance, the angle of his shield. He was preparing to channel raw aggression into a single, precise moment of impact, all while adhering to a strict code of chivalric conduct. This was not a street fight, it was a violent ceremony. He had to aim for specific target areas to score points honorably, avoiding actions that could be deemed unsporting or cowardly. The psychological pressure was immense. He was not just fighting for a prize, he was performing his identity before his peers, his lord, and his lady. A strong showing could make his reputation, while a poor one being unseated by a lesser knight or failing to break a lance could be a social and financial catastrophe. In those final seconds before the charge, a knight was alone with his training, his faith, and his fear, ready to transform months of meticulous preparation into a few seconds of explosive, glorious action. Yet for all its singular drama, the joust was only one part of the tournament spectacle. Many knights and seasoned veterans considered the true heart of the event, the ultimate test of a warrior's skill, to be the melee. This was not a one-on-one duel of precision. It was a sprawling, chaotic mock battle, a controlled war game where teams of knights clashed in a furious simulation of battlefield combat. Organizing this controlled chaos was the Marshal's greatest nightmare and his highest achievement, a logistical and diplomatic tightrope walk that required immense foresight to prevent the thrilling simulation from boiling over into genuine, deadly warfare. The first and most delicate task was the formation of the teams. This was far more than simply dividing a group of knights into two sides. The selection process was a subtle exercise in politics and psychology, designed to balance competitive spirit with the overarching need for peace. The Marshal and his council of heralds would pore over the list of registered competitors, their minds not on individual prowess alone, but on ancient grudges, current political alliances, and regional loyalties. The worst possible scenario was to place two knights with a bitter, personal feud on opposing teams. The raw aggression of the melee could easily provide the perfect cover for a premeditated act of vengeance, turning a sporting event into a tragedy. Conversely, placing powerful allied lords together on the same team could create an unbeatable faction that would dominate the field, making the contest predictable and boring for the crowd. The ideal was to create teams that were evenly matched in both skill and social standing, mixing rivals and allies in a way that encouraged fierce but honorable competition without reigniting old wars. Sometimes, teams were divided along geographic lines, perhaps the North versus the South, or they could be based on the allegiances of different royal courts. The goal was always to craft a narrative of rivalry that was compelling yet contained, a story that would thrill the audience without spilling its plot into real-world conflict. Once the teams were set, the knights and their captains would often retreat into strategy sessions. Unlike the joust, which was a pure test of individual horsemanship and nerve, the melee was a team sport that required coordination and tactics. Groups of knights who knew each other well, perhaps having fought together in actual campaigns, would develop plans. They might form a wedge to break an enemy line, or designate faster, lighter-equipped knights to flank and harass the opposition. They would establish signals, often shouted commands or specific banner movements, to coordinate their actions in the dust and din of the fight. A knight's value in the melee was not just his strength, but his ability to fight as part of a unit, to support his comrades, and to understand the broader flow of the battle. This strategic layer added a depth of military realism to the event, making it a valuable training exercise for the assembled aristocracy, a way to practice the arts of war without the stakes of actual death. To maintain the thin veneer of sport over actual combat, specialized weaponry was essential. Knights did not use their sharp, battlefield-ready weapons in the melee. Instead, they employed what were known as arms of courtesy, or weapons of peace. Swords were heavily blunted, their edges and points rounded off to prevent piercing plate armor. Maces and war hammers, terrifying weapons on a real battlefield, were often made of wood or boiled leather, designed to deliver a stunning blow rather than a crushing, fatal injury. The most iconic of these adapted weapons was the rebated lance, used for the initial cavalry charge that often began the melee. Like the jousting lance, it was designed to shatter spectacularly on impact, but its tip was a large, club-like coronal meant to grab and unhorse rather than penetrate. However, even with these precautions, the melee was an incredibly dangerous affair. The impact of a blunted sword swung with full force by a powerful man in armor could still cause severe concussions, break bones, or drive a dented breastplate into a knight's chest. The real and present danger is what gave the event its thrilling authenticity. The marshals and heralds, acting as referees, were the crucial force that maintained the boundary between vigorous sport and mortal danger. They rode around the periphery of the fighting on their own horses, their eyes constantly scanning the action. Their job was to identify any fighter who was using excessive force, attacking a knight who had already yielded, or most alarmingly, attempting to use a real, sharp weapon that had been smuggled onto the field. They had the authority to physically intervene, riding into the press of bodies to separate combatants, and they could disqualify a knight or his entire team on the spot for foul play. They also watched for knights who were in genuine distress, a rider who had been unhorsed and was being trampled, or a man whose helmet had been knocked askew, leaving him vulnerable. In these situations, they would blow their whistles to stop the action immediately, a dangerous but necessary intervention to prevent a simulated death from becoming a real one. The success of the entire tournament hinged on their vigilance and their unwavering authority to enforce the rules of the game. Yet for all the talk of honor and glory, there was another, far more tangible force driving knights to risk life and limb in the lists, the powerful allure of immense, undeniable profit. While the ideals of chivalry provided the noble soundtrack, the tournament's engine ran on a robust and highly lucrative economy of prizes and ransoms. Success in the arena wasn't just about earning renown, it was about securing wealth that could elevate a knight's standing, repay his substantial investments, and fund his entire way of life for years to come. This financial reality transformed the tournament from a mere sporting event into a high-stakes profession for the warrior class. The most prestigious symbol of this potential wealth was the prize itself, provided by the tournament's patron. These were not simple trophies or ribbons. They were displays of staggering opulence designed to attract the very best competitors from across the land. Days before the event began, these treasures would be gathered and put on a magnificent public display, often in a secured tent or under a special pavilion near the host's own stands. This exhibition served a crucial purpose. It was a powerful piece of marketing, tangible proof of the host's generosity, and the incredible rewards that awaited the champions. The gathered knights and commoners alike would file past, their eyes wide at the sight of heavy purses bulging with gold and silver coins, often amounting to a sum greater than a prosperous knight's annual income from his lands. But cash was just the beginning. Laid out on velvet cushions might be exquisitely crafted pieces of jewelry, a golden collar set with precious gems, an intricately worked brooch, or a ring of immense value. For the ultimate grand prize, a lord might even pledge a valuable piece of property, the rights to a profitable mill, the annual rents from a village, or even a small estate. This was life-changing wealth, offered up for the taking to the knight with the most skill, courage, and luck. The public showcasing of these prizes supercharged the competitive atmosphere, turning every practice session and every whispered strategy into a calculation for securing this legendary bounty. However, the official prize, as magnificent as it was often just the tip of the financial iceberg for a successful tournament night. The real money, the day-to-day profit that made the circuit sustainable, came from a complex and unwritten system known as the ransom economy. This was a practice so ingrained in tournament culture that it required no formal contract. It was governed by the code of chivalric honor and the relentless pressure of peer opinion. The rule was simple: when a knight was defeated, particularly in the melee where captures were common, he became the prisoner of the victor. His freedom, and more importantly the return of his incredibly expensive horse and armor, had to be purchased back with a ransom payment. This wasn't seen as shameful. It was simply the cost of doing business on the chivalric field. The negotiation of this ransom was a fascinating ritual in itself, often conducted by the knight's squires or heralds immediately after the action concluded. The value was not arbitrary. It was carefully calibrated to the status and wealth of the captured knight, and the quality of the equipment being held. A young, landless knight-errant might only have to pay a few silver coins for the return of his older, simpler armor and his single horse. But capturing a high-ranking duke or a famously wealthy baron was the equivalent of winning the lottery. His ransom would be negotiated in gold coins, and the value of his magnificent destrier, an animal bred for war and worth a fortune, and his custom-fitted Milanese plate armor could set a ransom figure that was astronomical. For the victorious knight, this created a direct and highly motivational feedback loop. The better he fought, the more valuable opponents he could capture, and the greater his financial windfall would be. A single spectacular tournament could set a knight up for life, allowing him to purchase better equipment, acquire land, and elevate his entire household's status. It turned martial prowess into a direct conduit for social and economic climbing, creating a class of professional tournament knights who traveled from event to event, not for fleeting glory, but for the very solid and bankable rewards of victory. As the final trumpet call echoed across the tournament field, signaling the end of the day's combat, the focus of the entire encampment shifted dramatically. The dust of the lists began to settle, and the air, once thick with the sounds of clashing steel and roaring crowds, now filled with a new, equally compelling aroma, the smell of a feast on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The grand banquet that followed the first day of competition was far more than a simple meal. It was a parallel spectacle, a calculated demonstration of the host's power and generosity that unfolded not in the tilt-yard, but at the table. This culinary theater required its own army of workers and its own staggering logistics, transforming a section of the field into a temporary epicenter of gastronomic ambition. The heart of this operation was the field kitchen, a sprawling, open-air factory of food production that would have put a modern restaurant to shame. Dozens of temporary clay ovens and open-fire roasting pits were constructed in a designated area, their fires stoked to a furious heat by an army of kitchen boys tasked with fetching wood and managing the coals. The scale of the cooking vessels alone was awe-inspiring. Enormous cauldrons, some large enough to stew an entire sheep, simmered over fires, tended by cooks wielding paddles the size of oars. Spit roasting was the order of the day for the prime meats, with whole oxen and scores of pigs and sheep skewered on iron rods that required multiple strong men to slowly turn them. ensuring the meat cooked evenly and its fats continuously basted the surface to a perfect, crackling crisp. The heat, the smoke, and the organized chaos of shouting cooks, running servants, and the sizzle of fat-hitting flames created a scene of intense industry that was a spectacle in itself for those permitted to catch a glimpse. Feeding the high table, where the host, his noble family, and his most honored knightly guests were seated, was an exercise in culinary art and political messaging. The dishes presented here were designed to astonish the eyes as much as please the palate. This was where the host's wealth was translated into edible gold. Swans and peacocks were roasted and then meticulously redressed in their own iridescent feathers, their beaks gilded with gold leaf and their bodies posed as if alive, carrying citrus fruits in their mouths. Elaborate savory pies, known as coffins, were constructed with thick, inedible pastry walls that acted as cooking vessels and were then broken open at the table to reveal a treasure trove of live birds that would fly out, or a mixture of meats, dried fruits, and expensive spices. The use of spices like saffron, pepper, cinnamon, and ginger was particularly telling. These were not just flavorings, they were luxury imports worth their weight in gold, and their prolific use was a direct, undeniable statement of the host's vast resources and his global trade connections. A heavily spiced dish was an edible bank statement. The service of this feast was a carefully choreographed performance of its own, a procession of servers, often the sons of local gentry earning their stripes in a noble household, moved with practiced precision from the kitchen fires to the high table. They carried these incredible dishes aloft on great platters, presenting them first to the host for his approval before serving the guests in a strict order of precedence that mirrored the social hierarchy of the tournament itself. The air in the great dining pavilion would be filled with music from minstrels and the lively chatter of hundreds of people, all participating in a shared experience of abundance. For the commoners and lower-ranked knights dining in their own encampments or at long trestle tables, the fare was simpler but no less plentiful: hearty bread, thick stews, roasted meats, and rivers of ale, but the message was the same. Their lord was a provider, a man of such means that he could fill the bellies of thousands without a second thought. This act of communal feasting was the final, masterful stroke of the day, binding everyone from the greatest duke to the humblest squire in a shared experience of the host's magnificent generosity, ensuring that the glory of the table was remembered just as fondly as the glory of the field. Yet the spectacle was never confined to the clashing of steel in the lists. A tournament was a total sensory experience, a multi-day festival where the thrilling violence of the joust was balanced by a continuous program of delight and diversion. The spaces between the martial events and the long evenings after the sun had set were filled with a vibrant tapestry of performance and artistry. This was the domain of the entertainers, a traveling class of minstrels, jugglers, acrobats, jesters, and poets whose sole purpose was to weave a thread of constant amusement through the fabric of the event, ensuring the noble guests were never bored and the atmosphere remained one of celebratory wonder. The responsibility for this fell, like everything else, to the tournament marshal and his staff. His hiring strategy was a delicate balancing act of quality, variety, and budget. He couldn't simply hire the first troupe of musicians he found. He was essentially curating a live entertainment channel for the most discerning audience in the realm. For the highest-ranking nobles, particularly the hosting lord's private pavilion and the high table at feasts, he would seek out the most prestigious and expensive performers. These were the master minstrels, often retained by great houses, who specialized in the complex, poetic chansons to digest epic songs of legendary heroes like Charlemagne or King Arthur. Their performances were not mere background noise. They were edifying entertainment that connected the current tournament to the grand myths of chivalry, flattering the noble audience by placing them within that storied tradition. A skilled poet might even compose an original piece for the event, celebrating the host's lineage and generosity, a valuable piece of political theater set to music. For the broader crowds thronging the tournament grounds, the marshal hired a dizzying array of street performers to create a genuine fairground atmosphere. Acrobats and tumblers would perform breathtaking feats of agility in open spaces, drawing gasps from the crowd as they built human pyramids or walked on stilts high above the masses. Fire eaters and jugglers manipulated danger and objects with mesmerizing skill, their acts providing a different kind of thrill than the joust. The most ubiquitous figure was the jester or fool, a master of satire and physical comedy. His license to mock and parody was a vital pressure valve in the rigidly formal court culture. A clever jester could poke fun at the affectations of the nobility, gently rib the knights for their preening vanity, or lampoon current political events, all under the protective guise of folly. This laughter was a crucial social glue, allowing for a temporary loosening of hierarchies and providing a shared experience that bonded everyone from the duke to the dirt farmer. Managing this eclectic troupe was its own unique challenge. The entertainers were housed in their own section of the tent city, a vibrant and often raucous neighborhood that required its own oversight. The Marshals men had to schedule their appearances to ensure a steady stream of diversion without overlapping performances or creating dull patches. They also had to manage the performers' inevitable rivalries and ensure their safety as they moved through the crowded, sometimes rowdy encampment. Payment was often a mix of upfront fees, promises of room and board, and the hope of generous tips from pleased noble patrons. For these artists, a major tournament was the gig of the season, a chance to perform for a massive, wealthy audience and secure future work. Their presence transformed the tournament from a mere sporting event into a true medieval Renaissance fair, a total immersion in a world of artistry, skill, and wonder that captivated every sense and ensured the memory of the event would be about far more than just who broke the most lances. Yet for all the blunted swords and ceremonial rules, the air around the tournament field carried another, more somber scent beneath the roasted meats and wood smoke, the faint, ever-present tang of vinegar and medicinal herbs. The thrilling spectacle of clashing steel was underpinned by a grim and unavoidable reality. This was an exceptionally dangerous pursuit. For every knight who rode from the lists in triumph, another was carried away, broken and bleeding. Acknowledging this risk was not a sign of weakness but a mark of the event's brutal authenticity, and the most pragmatic hosts prepared for it with the same meticulous care they gave to the feasting or the heraldry. This preparation centered on a specific, crucial area often positioned downwind of the noble pavilions, the medical tent, a place where the ideals of chivalry met the stark science and faith of the medieval world. Within this space worked a unique partnership, a duo tasked with managing both the physical and spiritual consequences of the tournament's violence. The first was the surgeon, a craftsman of the body whose skills were learned not in universities but through grim, hands-on experience, often on the battlefields of Europe. His toolkit was a terrifying array of instruments designed for brutal efficiency: saws for amputations, sharp hooks for extracting broken lance tips from wounds, and strong leather straps for patients to bite down on during agonizing procedures. His most common tasks were setting compound fractures, bones shattered by the impact of a mace or a fall from a galloping horse, and treating severe concussions, the latter often by the questionable method of drilling a small hole in the skull to relieve pressure. Anesthesia was crude, often little more than strong wine or a mixture of herbs like mandrake and henbane to dull the senses, meaning surgeries were swift, agonizing affairs. The surgeon's success rate was low by modern standards, but his presence offered the only hope for survival from the most catastrophic injuries, a desperate gamble between certain death and a slim chance of a painful recovery. Working alongside him, often offering a different kind of solace, was the cleric. His tools were not made of steel but of wood and scripture, a stole, a vial of holy oil, and a well-worn prayer book. While the surgeon fought for the body, the cleric tended to the soul. His primary and most solemn duty was to administer the last rites to knights whose injuries were clearly mortal. In an age where a deep puncture wound or a crushed limb almost inevitably led to fatal infection, the spiritual comfort of a final confession and absolution was considered as essential as any physical treatment. The sight of the cleric moving quietly among the wounded, his head bowed in prayer, was a stark reminder to all participants of the very real stakes of their chosen sport. This spiritual care extended beyond the dying. Before competing, many knights would attend a special mass and receive a general absolution for the violence they were about to commit, framing it within the church's complex and often contradictory views on chivalry. The cleric's presence helped sanctify the event, providing a moral framework that allowed these devout men to engage in such a brutal activity without fear of eternal damnation, balancing the salvation of their souls with the pursuit of worldly glory. Despite the precautions of blunted weapons and rules of engagement, the mortality rates at these events were shockingly high. The idea that tournament injuries were minor is a modern misconception. A fall from a charging destrier while wearing 80 pounds of plate armor could cause devastating internal injuries, even without a visible wound. A poorly aimed blow with a rebated lance could still crush a windpipe or drive a helmet's visor into a knight's face. The greatest danger, however, was infection. A compound fracture where the bone pierced the skin was almost a death sentence in an era before germ theory and antibiotics. What began as a clean break could swiftly lead to gangrene, tetanus, or septicemia, claiming a knight's life days or weeks after the tournament had ended and the crowds had dispersed. The medical tent, therefore, was not a marginal footnote to the festivities. It was an integral part of the tournament's ecosystem, a sobering testament to the authentic peril these warriors faced every time they rode into the lists. It stood as a quiet, necessary counterbalance to the exuberant pageantry, ensuring that the pursuit of honor was never completely divorced from the sobering reality of sacrifice. While the knights and organizers prepared for glory, an entirely different kind of preparation was underway for the thousands of people who would soon flood into the site, all eager to witness the spectacle. A tournament was a deeply hierarchical society in miniature, and this was nowhere more visible than in the meticulous arrangements made for the audience. The experience of watching the games was carefully engineered to reflect and reinforce the social order, ensuring that everyone from the highest duke to the lowliest farmer had a place, but those places were worlds apart in both comfort and perspective. For the nobility and the tournament's most honored guests, viewing the action was an exercise in luxury and display. The most skilled carpenters on site were tasked with constructing the grandstands, or scaffolds, which were elaborate tiered wooden structures rising high above the field. These were not simple bleachers, they were temporary palaces of observation. The best seats, directly opposite the center of the lists to provide the perfect vantage point for the jousts, were reserved for the hosting lord, his family, and visiting royalty. These prime boxes were often enclosed with protective barriers and, most importantly, shaded by vibrant canopies or awnings made of expensive fabric like silk or dyed wool. These canopies served a dual purpose. They protected delicate complexions from the sun and offered a respite from the occasional rain shower, but they also functioned as a massive, undeniable status symbol. Their colors and heraldic devices announced the importance of the people sitting beneath them to everyone else on the field. Cushions and even small pieces of furniture might be brought in to enhance comfort, transforming the act of watching into a statement of power and privilege. The noble spectators didn't just come to see the tournament, they came to be seen, to network, and to affirm their place at the very top of the social pyramid. For the vast majority of attendees, the commoners, the merchants, the servants, and the general populace, the viewing experience was a far more rustic and energetic affair. There were no reserved seats or comfortable cushions. Instead, the Marshals men would simply rope off large areas around the periphery of the lists, creating open standing room-only sections. The true savvy among the crowd, those who arrived early, would seek out any available high ground. A natural slope or hill overlooking the field was the most coveted real estate, offering a panoramic view without the press of the crowd. People would spread out blankets and settle in for the day, much like a modern audience at an outdoor concert. The atmosphere here was boisterous and communal, a stark contrast to the reserved formality of the noble scaffolds. This is where the real energy of the event thrived, in the gasps, cheers, and collective groans of the common folk who bet their pennies on their favorite champions and experience the drama with raw, unfiltered emotion. And where such a large crowd gathered, commerce was never far behind. The tournament site didn't just host a sporting event, it spontaneously generated a massive, thriving marketplace. The host's officials would license food vendors and other sellers, granting them the right to set up their stalls in a designated area, often forming a bustling lane of commerce just behind the main viewing areas. The air would fill with the enticing smells of 100 different quick meals, sizzling sausages, meat pies with thick crusts, roasted nuts, and sweet honey cakes. Drink sellers did a roaring trade in ale and cider, their makeshift taps flowing from early morning until the last spectator departed. This was essential, as the host's own kitchens only catered to the noble guests. The common audience was expected to fend for themselves, and an entire service industry emerged to meet that demand. Alongside the food, a vibrant souvenir trade flourished. Craftsmen would set up stalls selling trinkets and mementos, ribbons in the colors of popular knights or noble houses, cheap badges made of tin or lead depicting heraldic animals, and even small, crudely carved wooden figures of jousting knights. For many, purchasing a small token was a way to physically carry a piece of the magnificent spectacle home with them. But this commercial energy had a darker, inevitable underbelly. The dense, distracted crowds presented a perfect hunting ground for pickpockets, cutpurses, and con artists. These opportunistic criminals would travel from event to event, just like the professional knights, practicing their own dishonorable trade amidst the celebration. Their presence was such a common feature of large medieval gatherings that warnings about them were a standard part of public announcements, and the host's security force of men-at-arms had to be constantly vigilant not just for brawls, but for the subtle, quick-fingered theft that could sour the experience for countless attendees. The audience's experience was thus a complete microcosm of medieval life itself, a mixture of awe-inspiring spectacle, communal joy, bustling commerce, and the ever-present need to keep a hand on one's purse. The final hours before the tournament's official commencement were not a time of rest, but of intense, focused preparation, a period where the air itself seemed to crackle with a blend of anticipation and razor-sharp concentration. The festive atmosphere of the encampment took on a new, more serious tone as the competing knights and their teams transitioned from arrivals and setup to the critical work of fine-tuning their bodies, their animals, and their minds for the imminent challenge. This was the calm before the storm, a deliberate and purposeful rush of activity where every moment was dedicated to gaining the slightest edge. Inside the vibrant pavilions, away from the prying eyes of rivals, seasoned knights held quiet, intense councils of war with their trusted squires and senior members of their retinue. These strategy sessions were less about grand, sweeping battle plans and more about targeted, tactical analysis. The tournament roles, now complete, provided a list of every competitor. Knights would pore over this list, their experience allowing them to quickly categorize their potential opponents. They weren't just reading names, they were recalling reputations, fighting styles, and past performances. A knight known for favoring a high, powerful strike to the helm would require a different defensive posture than one who was notoriously skilled at aiming a lance low to unhorse his opponents by striking the shield or breastplate. These discussions were grounded in a deep, practical understanding of heraldry. A knight's coat of arms often hinted at his regional style of combat or his school of training. Was he from the Italian school, known for its technical finesse and lighter armor, or the German tradition, which favored overwhelming power and resilience? These were not abstract questions. They were vital calculations that would determine how a knight would approach each pass in the lists. The squires, acting as junior intelligence officers, would share gossip and observations gathered from the practice fields, reporting on the condition of a rival's horses or noting if he seemed to favor turning his mount one way over another. This collective intelligence was then used to craft a personalized approach for each potential matchup, a mental playbook designed to exploit a specific weakness or counter a known strength. Outside, the tiltyards and open fields surrounding the lists became a hive of controlled, purposeful motion. This was not the time for showing off or expending energy in reckless displays. Instead, knights and their squires engaged in last-minute drills that were the very definition of precision over power. For the knights, this often meant solitary work, focusing on the minute mechanics of the craft. They would practice couching their lances over and over again, ensuring the weapon was held at the exact same, consistent angle every single time, building the muscle memory required to deliver a blow with robotic consistency amidst the adrenaline-fueled chaos of a real charge. They would work on their stance in the saddle, finding the perfect balance between being rooted for impact and remaining flexible enough to absorb a shock without being unhorsed. Every movement was broken down, analyzed, and repeated until it was perfect. This meticulous preparation extended in its most critical form to the warhorses. The final bonding and tuning between a knight and his destrier were considered sacrosanct. A knight would personally oversee his horse's final exercises, putting the animal through a series of drills designed to reinforce discipline and focus. They would practice the charge over and over again, but at a controlled pace, ensuring the horse would run in a perfectly straight line down its side of the tilt barrier without shying away at the last second. The sound of trumpets would be played near them to accustom them to the blare that would signal the start of each joust. Squires would run alongside, waving flags and pennants, desensitizing the horse to the fluttering distractions of the arena. The knight would speak to his mount constantly, a low, steady murmur of reassurance that reinforced their partnership. This was not merely horsemanship, it was a form of psychological preparation for the animal, ensuring it would remain a calm, responsive partner rather than a panicked liability when faced with the terrifying sight of another armored mass thundering directly toward it. The final hours were a symphony of whispered strategies, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth, and the quiet, confident communication between a warrior and his most vital ally, all building towards the moment the herald would finally raise his horn and shatter the tense silence. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on the final evening, casting long shadows across the now silent lists, a profound shift occurred in the atmosphere. The boisterous energy of the practice fields, the clamor of the armorers' hammers, and the lively buzz of the market all faded away, replaced by a deepening, solemn quiet. For the competing knights, the time for physical preparation was over. Now, on the eve of the tournament, the focus turned inward to the spirit. This was a moment of intense personal and spiritual reckoning, a necessary ritual to sanctify the brutal violence of the coming day and reconcile the paradoxical life of a Christian warrior. The center of this transformation was not the tilt yard, but the local chapel or a specially erected temporary church on the tournament grounds. As darkness fell, knights began to arrive not with their squires and entourages, but alone or in small, quiet groups. They came not in their brilliant heraldic surcoats, but in simple, dark robes or tunics. The vibrant peacock colors of the day were shed, replaced by the humble palette of penitence and reflection. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the smell of beeswax candles and incense, a stark sensory contrast to the sense of sweat, leather, and horse that had dominated the camp. The only sounds were the low murmur of prayers, the soft rustle of woolen garments, and the occasional scrape of a boot on the stone floor. This was the beginning of the vigil, a long night of wakeful prayer and meditation that many knights undertook as a final purification before the contest. The ceremony itself was a powerful blend of the sacred and the martial. The knights would approach the altar one by one, but they did not come empty-handed. They brought the very instruments of their trade to be blessed. A priest would move among them, sprinkling holy water on the carefully polished surfaces of their helmets, shields, and swords. He would offer prayers for their safety and for their souls, asking for divine protection not from the fight, but from dishonor, cowardice, and the sin of excessive wrath. This act of blessing was crucial. It transformed their gear from mere tools of violence into consecrated instruments of a chivalric calling. A knight who had his sword blessed was not simply sharpening a weapon, he was dedicating his strength to a higher purpose, vowing to use it within the bounds of a sacred code. The armor that had been so meticulously maintained by his squire was now spiritually fortified by the church, becoming a metaphorical shield for his soul as much as his body. The spiritual preparation reached its zenith with the taking of communion. In receiving the Eucharist, the knights sought a state of grace, cleansing themselves of sin to face the potential of death with a clear conscience. This was not a casual observance, it was a deeply felt necessity. The Church's stance on tournaments had long been ambivalent, often condemning them for the vanity and bloodshed they encouraged. By participating fully in the sacrament, the knights were, in a way, negotiating with that doctrine. They were demonstrating that their intentions were pure, that they competed not for base glory or greed, but as an expression of their divinely ordained role as protectors and paragons of virtue. This communion was also a powerful act of unity. Knights who would be fierce rivals on the morrow knelt side by side at the same rail, acknowledging a shared faith and a shared humanity that transcended the competitive fervor to come. The final act of the night was the swearing of oaths. Before the altar, often upon a relic of a saint or the Bible itself, each knight would swear a solemn vow to uphold the principles of chivalric combat. The exact words varied, but the sentiment was always the same: a pledge to fight with honor, to show mercy to a defeated opponent, to respect the rules of the tournament, and to champion the causes of the weak and the innocent. This was the chivalric ideal made manifest, a public and sacred promise that bound the knight to a higher standard of conduct. It was a psychological anchor, a vow intended to hold fast in the heat of battle when adrenaline and aggression threatened to overwhelm reason and mercy. As they spoke these words in the hushed silence of the chapel, the knights were not just preparing for a sport. They were mentally armoring themselves against their own baser instincts, forging a spiritual resolve as strong as the steel they would wear. The echo of their oaths in the quiet chapel was the true starting pistol for the tournament, setting the stage for a drama that was as much about inner character as it was about outward strength. But while knights prayed and squires polished, a far more pragmatic operation was already in motion under the cloak of night. While the spiritual and ceremonial preparations were vital for the soul of the tournament, its body, the physical safety of thousands of people, and a king's ransom in treasure depended on a force whose work was deliberately meant to go unnoticed. This was the domain of the host's men-at-arms, the professional soldiers whose unglamorous, tireless vigilance was the bedrock upon which the entire illusion of chivalric peace was built. Their deployment was a military campaign in miniature, a masterclass in preventative security designed to ensure the celebration never spiraled into a catastrophe. The Marshals' strategy for his security force was one of layered, visible deterrence. Long before the first spectators arrived at dawn, teams of men-at-arms were dispatched to establish a perimeter around the entire massive site. This was not a simple fence, it was a psychological boundary. They would rope off critical areas and post guards at all major access points, the ends of the roads leading into the field, the entrances to the noble viewing scaffolds, and the approaches to the stable areas. Their presence was calculated to be authoritative but not overtly threatening. Dressed in the host's livery over polished brigandines or chainmail, they stood as silent, watchful reminders of the Lord's authority and the rule of law that governed even this temporary city. The goal was to make their presence felt everywhere, creating a sense of ordered safety that would discourage mischief before it could even begin, allowing the common folk to revel without fear and the nobility to relax in the assurance of their protection. Their most sensitive and ongoing duty, however, was the protection of the prizes. The tent or pavilion displaying the golden collars, jeweled swords, and purses of silver was a magnet for envy and desperation. Guarding it was an assignment given only to the most trusted and steady veterans. They would be stationed in a tight, visible cordon around the structure, changed at frequent intervals to maintain alertness. Their orders were simple: no one except the marshal, the herald, or the designated prize stewards was to pass. They were to be polite but utterly immovable, a human wall between unimaginable temptation and the would-be thief. The value at stake was so immense that the temptation for organized crime was very real. These guards were the final, crucial barrier against a heist that would utterly humiliate the host and shatter the tournament's credibility. Yet the most volatile challenge the men-at-arms faced was not from external thieves. but from within the very community, the tournament was designed to entertain. The encampment was a pressurized cooker of rivalries, ego, and alcohol. Knights from feuding families, forced into close quarters, could easily reignite ancient grievances after a few too many cups of wine. Their retinues, fiercely loyal and often just as well armed, were a constant source of potential brawls. The security force had to act as diplomats and peacekeepers as much as soldiers. They patrolled the tent city in pairs or small groups, their eyes constantly scanning for heated arguments or the gathering of hostile factions. Their intervention had to be swift, firm, and tactful. The last thing the host wanted was the embarrassment of his own men having to forcibly restrain a celebrated, albeit drunk, champion. They were trained to de-escalate, to separate, and to remind all parties of the oaths of peace they had sworn and the heavy fines that awaited those who broke them. It was a delicate dance of respecting the status of the nobles while unequivocally enforcing the Marshals' law. Finally, as the sun rose on the first day and the crowds began to stream in, the men-at-arms faced their most chaotic test, crowd control. Thousands of people, packed tightly together, heated by the sun and fueled by excitement and drink, could become a dangerous mob in an instant. The security teams were strategically positioned throughout the viewing areas, especially at the front of the standing sections to prevent a crush against the barriers enclosing the deadly jousting lane. They watched for pickpockets working the dense throngs and broke up scuffles over the best viewing spots. Their role was to be the calm, steady center of the storm, directing flow, answering questions, and ensuring that the exhilarating energy of the event never tipped over into panic or violence. The success of their unseen, thankless work was measured in its absence, by the fact that the only clashes anyone would remember were the glorious, sanctioned ones between knights and the shining lists. Beyond the public oaths and the blessings of the church existed a far more complex and shadowy world of conduct, governed by an unwritten code as influential as any official rulebook. This was the intricate dance of chivalric etiquette, a set of social expectations that dictated everything from how a knight issued a challenge to how he accepted defeat. The public face of this code was one of magnanimity and honor. A victorious knight was expected to praise the skill of his fallen opponent, to offer a hand up, and to downplay his own achievement with practiced modesty. In reality, this was a high-stakes performance where every gesture was scrutinized. A knight who won but acted the boor, gloating over a defeated rival or treating his squires with cruelty, could find his victory hollow, his reputation stained by the courtly gossip that spread through the encampment faster than any herald's announcement. This courtly pressure was a powerful, invisible enforcer, often more effective than any marshal's fine at maintaining a veneer of civility over the raw aggression of the competition. Yet for every knight striving to embody this ideal, there was another willing to exploit its loopholes or bypass it entirely through deception. The immense prestige and financial rewards on offer created a powerful incentive for espionage, turning the tournament grounds into a hotbed of subterfuge. The most sought-after targets for this intrigue were the heralds themselves. As the living repositories of tournament intelligence, they knew everything: the secret injuries knights were hiding, the preferred techniques of specific competitors, the weaknesses of a particular warhorse, and, most crucially, the detailed scoring of the early rounds that could determine future matchups. A knight anxious about an upcoming joust might attempt to bribe a herald, not for a fixed outcome, but for a simple advantage, a whispered insight into his opponent's habits. A less scrupulous competitor might seek to learn if a rival was nursing a cracked rib from a previous melee, information that could be exploited with well-aimed blows during a charge. The tournament organizers were acutely aware of this threat and protected their heralds accordingly. These men were chosen not only for their knowledge, but for their unimpeachable integrity. They were paid well by the host to ensure their loyalty could not be easily bought, and any herald caught selling information faced career-ending disgrace and severe punishment. The Marshals' security force kept a discreet watch on interactions around the herald's tent, ensuring that conversations remained official and public. This constant cat-and-mouse game between those seeking a clandestine edge and those tasked with preserving the event's integrity was a silent, relentless undercurrent flowing beneath the pageantry. The threat extended beyond information to the very tools of the trade. Sabotage, though a desperate and deeply dishonorable act, was a persistent fear that required constant countermeasures. The most vulnerable point was a knight's equipment. A rival's agent, perhaps a bribed servant or a mercenary with a handful of silver, might attempt to sneak into the pavilion of a favored champion and subtly tamper with his gear. A single over-tightened strap on a breastplate could restrict breathing at a critical moment. A few grains of sand poured into the intricate hinge of a visor could jam it shut during a pass. The most devastating and cowardly act was the sabotaged lance, where a deep, hidden crack could be carved into the shaft, ensuring it would snap prematurely under the stress of impact, costing the knight a vital point and potentially unseating him. To combat this, a knight's squires took on the role of vigilant sentinels. Armor was never left unattended. One squire was always on guard duty within the pavilion, and the ritual of inspecting every piece of equipment before donning it became a sacred, life-saving practice. They would test every buckle, flex every lance, and examine every strap for signs of interference, their vigilance forming the final, personal layer of defense against the tournament's darker impulses. This atmosphere of whispered secrets and silent threats meant that a knight's preparation was never truly complete until he was actually in the saddle, his gear proven sound, his focus absolute, and his trust placed only in the small circle of men who had accompanied him into the glittering, treacherous world of the lists. All the meticulous planning, the months of labor, the king's charter, and the knight's prayers, all of it now hung in the balance, utterly at the mercy of the one force no medieval organizer could ever control: the weather. We picture these events under brilliant sunshine, but the reality was often a tense gamble against the skies. A sudden, torrential downpour didn't just dampen spirits, it threatened to unravel the entire enterprise, transforming the glorious field of honor into a treacherous, muddy quagmire and testing the organizer's ingenuity to its absolute limit. The most immediate casualty of rain was the tournament field itself. The lists, so carefully leveled and packed by countless feet, could become a slick, dangerous bog in a matter of hours. For the joust, this was a disaster. A horse charging down the tilt lane risked losing its footing entirely, potentially crashing into the barrier and catastrophically injuring both itself and its rider. The thick, clinging mud would sap the animal's strength, turning a majestic charge into a labored slog and robbing the impact of its spectacular power. In the melee, the footing was even more critical. Knights in 60 pounds of plate armor, already unstable, found themselves slipping and sinking with every step. What was designed as a display of martial prowess could quickly devolve into a farcical, slow-motion struggle for balance, where the victor was often the one who simply remained upright the longest. Beyond the sheer danger, there was the immense financial cost. The brilliant silks of the pavilions, the intricately embroidered banners, and the expensive woolen fabrics of the noble spectators' clothing were all highly susceptible to water damage. Mud splatters could ruin a priceless tapestry, and waterlogged silk banners would never hang the same way again. A single storm could wipe out a small fortune in material wealth before a single lance was even couched. Faced with this threat, the organizers did not simply wring their hands and hope for the best. They developed a sophisticated set of contingency plans, their effectiveness a true mark of a marshal's experience. The most common and immediate response was the simple, heartbreaking delay. Heralds would announce that the games were paused until the weather cleared and the field could be made serviceable again. This was not a decision taken lightly, as it created an instant logistical crisis. But what did they do to actually fix the field? Accounts suggest that armies of servants and even recruited spectators would be mobilized into an emergency workforce. They would spread fresh straw and hay by the cartload across the worst areas, particularly the jousting lane and the approaches to it. This ancient technique served multiple purposes. It absorbed surface water, provided desperately needed traction for hooves and boots, and helped to prevent the churned earth from becoming a complete morass. For the nobility and their scaffolds, Large waxed canvas sheets or additional awnings would be hastily deployed to keep their valuable seating areas dry. The response to a sudden shower was a coordinated flurry of activity, a testament to the fact that the army of staff was prepared not just for the event itself, but for its potential disasters. The most drastic contingency, however, was the full postponement, the medieval equivalent of a rain date. This was a decision of last resort, fraught with immense difficulty. Announcing that the entire tournament was delayed by a day or more created a domino effect of problems. The most pressing issue was the crowd. Thousands of people who had planned for a single day's outing now found themselves stranded. The host, bound by the codes of generosity and hospitality, was often forced to extend his provision of food and drink to avoid widespread discontent or even riots. This meant his stewards had to scramble to secure additional supplies from the surrounding countryside, negotiating under pressure with local merchants who knew they could charge a premium. Then came the question of lodging. The noble knights and their entourages were already housed in their pavilions, which, if well made, could withstand a night of rain. But the common spectators, who often planned to return home that evening, faced a serious dilemma. Some would simply have to endure a miserable, wet night huddled under whatever shelter they could find, while others might flood into the nearby town, overwhelming its inns and hostels and straining relations with the local populace. Furthermore, a postponement disrupted the intricate schedules of the participants themselves. Knights who had mentally and physically prepared themselves for a specific day now had to maintain their edge through an unscheduled period of waiting, a psychological challenge that could be as draining as the combat itself. The Marshals and heralds had to recalibrate the entire tournament bracket and schedule, a complex administrative task. Despite these nightmares, the option to postpone did exist, and it was a powerful tool. It demonstrated the host's commitment to delivering a full and worthy spectacle, not a compromised and muddy shadow of one. His willingness to absorb the staggering additional cost of feeding and housing everyone for an extra day was, in its own way, another flex of his wealth and power, a message that even the heavens could not ultimately disrupt his magnificent show. The ability to successfully manage a weather delay was perhaps the ultimate test of the medieval tournament machine, proving that its true strength lay not in fair weather pageantry, but in its resilient, adaptable, and utterly determined logistical heart. Dawn breaks not with a golden glow, but with a thin, gray mist clinging to the damp grass, the world holding its breath. The raucous chaos of the past week has vanished, replaced by a profound, almost sacred silence. This is the final hour, and moving through the stillness like a ghost is the tournament marshal, a figure transformed from an administrator into a solitary sentinel. His ledgers and schedules are put away. Now his tools are his eyes, his ears, and a mind racing through a final, silent checklist of 1,000 details. This is his last walk, a final inspection where every sight and sound is a data point, a variable in the complex equation of the day to come. His boots make no sound on the dew-soaked turf as he first approaches the very heart of the spectacle, the lists. He runs a gloved hand along the cold, wet wood of the tilt barrier, testing its solidity. He leans his weight against the stout posts that hold it, searching for the slightest give, the faintest creak of a loose joint. A failure here wouldn't just mean a lost point. It could mean a catastrophic collision. His eyes trace the line of the barrier down its entire length, ensuring no splintered section or hidden obstacle could catch a hoof and send a ton of horse and steel tumbling. He steps into the arena itself, his gaze sweeping the ground for any divot or hidden stone that could spell disaster for a charging destrier. Every footfall is a calculation, every glance an assessment. This empty field is a deceptively peaceful place that will soon become a theater of controlled violence, and its physical integrity is the first and most non-negotiable requirement for the drama to unfold safely. From the lists, his path takes him to the periphery, where the heralds are gathering. These masters of ceremony are no longer the jovial broadcasters of the previous days. They stand in quiet clusters, going over their scrolls one last time, their voices low murmurs as they practice the pronunciation of complex, foreign names and titles. The marshal exchanges a nod with the chief herald, a conversation without words. It says the roles are final, the pairings are set, the rules are memorized. These men are the narrators and the judges, the living algorithm that will translate violent impacts into scores and glory. Their precision is paramount. A mispronounced name could insult a powerful lord. A miscounted point could spark a bitter dispute that tarnishes the entire event. The marshal sees the focused intensity in their eyes and moves on, satisfied. The story is ready to be told. The silence is then broken not by a voice, but by a sound, a deep, metallic click, followed by the rhythmic scrape of steel on steel. He follows the noise to the knight's encampment, and here the atmosphere is electric with a different kind of energy. The vibrant pavilions are now armories. Through open flaps, he glimpses scenes of intense, purposeful ritual. Squires, their faces etched with concentration, are fitting the final pieces of plate armor onto their masters. There is no conversation, only the sacred sounds of the arming ceremony. The hiss of leather straps being pulled taut, the definitive clamp of a vambrace being locked onto a forearm, the heavy thud of a breastplate being settled onto padded shoulders. Knights stand like statues, their identities erased by great helms, their breathing the only sign of life within the polished steel shells. The marshal does not interrupt, he merely observes. He sees a squire test the articulation of a knight's gauntlet one final time, and a nod from within the helm signals approval. This is the calm at the center of the storm, where months of preparation are being physically locked into place. Finally, he turns his attention to the edges of the field, where the first murmurs of the day are beginning to rise. The crowd is assembling. It starts as a trickle eager merchants securing the best spots for their stalls, farmers and their families spreading out blankets on the chosen hillside. Then the trickle becomes a stream, and the stream a river of humanity flowing in from all the surrounding roads. The air, once filled with the scent of damp earth, now carries the aroma of baking bread and wood smoke from the early food vendors. The marshal's security force is already in position. Their postures relaxed, but their eyes constantly scanning, directing foot traffic, and maintaining clear paths. He watches the dynamic map of the audience form, the social order recreating itself instinctively. The commoners claiming the grassy slopes, the wealthy merchants securing space on the temporary wooden galleries, all of them abuzz with a contagious, rising anticipation. Their energy is a tangible force, a wave of expectation that crashes against the quiet preparation of the field. Satisfied, the marshal takes one last look across the entire scene, the pristine lists, the poised heralds, the arming knights, the gathering thousands. Every piece is in its place. The complex machine he has spent months building is assembled, oiled, and ready. He turns and walks toward the host's pavilion, not with haste, but with the steady pace of a man who has done all he can. The silence has been completely banished now, replaced by the low, gathering roar of the crowd and the distant fanfare of a trumpet calling the nobility to their seats. The stage is set, the actors are ready, the audience is waiting. All that remains is for the marshal to give the final, simple nod that will set the entire magnificent, precarious, glorious engine in motion. So as the final competitor rides from the field and the last banner is carefully folded away, we're left with a truly staggering realization. The medieval tournament was so much more than the climactic clash of knights we see in films. It was one of the most ambitious and complex peacetime operations the pre-modern world ever attempted. Think of it not as a simple sporting event, but as the medieval equivalent of launching a military invasion and hosting a global summit and producing a blockbuster theatrical spectacle, all at the same time, in a field, with no modern technology. Every single element we've explored, from the political maneuvering for the king's charter to the armies of carpenters and the networks of spies, was a critical component of a machine of almost unimaginable scale. The true legacy of these events lies not in the shattered lances, but in the brilliant, hidden logistics that made them possible. This was a world that could move mountains without bulldozers, feed thousands without refrigeration, and enforce intricate rules of engagement without instant communication. It was a testament to human ingenuity, to the ability to orchestrate chaos into a coherent and magnificent narrative. The tournament was a mirror held up to medieval society itself, reflecting its rigid hierarchies, its deep-seated faith, its martial values, and its astonishing capacity for organization and art. The stands full of cheering commoners and the nobles in their silks were not just an audience. They were the final, vital piece of the production, their energy and belief completing the illusion and cementing the host's power. And that is the ultimate thought to take away. The next time you picture a knight in shining armor receiving his trophy amid thunderous applause, remember to also picture the hundreds of unseen hands that built the stage he stands on. See the marshal's endless ledgers, smell the smoke of the armorer's forges, hear the whispers of the diplomats who secured the peace, and feel the tension of the men-at-arms keeping watch through the night. The glory was real, but it was earned long before the first charge. It was earned by the meticulous, relentless, and often forgotten effort that transformed an empty field into a temporary capital of dreams, proving that the foundation of any lasting spectacle is never just power or wealth, but the profound and humble power of a plan perfectly executed.